It is called America's Best Idea, saving the most beautiful, massive, unique, and impressive natural and historical places, not only for today's visitors, but for future generations. But the units of the United States National Park Service exemplify the best of what America has to offer. There are many names you know, like Yellowstone and the Everglades.
Yosemites.
And there are many more that you should. But all are truly special. They are massive. They are iconic. They are beautiful. They are historical. They are American. This is a history of the United States National Park Service. There are 423 units in the National Park Service. Specifically, 63 are designated as national parks. These units make up the national park system and are home to some of the most extraordinary landscapes imaginable, along with America's irreplaceable historical treasures. The four most common units are national parks, national monuments, national historical parks, and historical sites. Beyond the four main types, there are almost 20 other categories of units in the National Park Service. These include recreational areas, national lakeshores, and national seashores.
National parks are not built. God did that in the beginning. So work in them is directed at the preservation of their splendid features.
National parks are set aside for their natural beauty, unique geology features, their diverse ecosystems, their historical significance, and their recreational opportunities. 30 states have the privilege of having national parks in them, as do some of the United States territories. California has the most national parks, with 9, followed by Alaska with 8, Utah with 5, and Colorado with 4. The largest national park is in Alaska with over 8 million acres, making it larger than 9 of the smallest states in the United States. The smallest national park is Gateway Arch National Park in Missouri at 91 acres. The smallest unit in the whole system is in a museum in Philadelphia with the Benjamin Franklin National Memorial. This unit is less than 0.01 acres large. It's just a statue. Every state, every territory, even Washington, D.C. has a National Park Service unit in it. The estimated total area protected by the National Park Service is around 85 million acres. The 100-year history of the National Park Service is a long and complicated journey. Since its founding, the National Park Service has had millions upon millions of visitors each year. Starting from just a few thousand acres in northern Wyoming, the Park Service has expanded to protect many of America's most iconic and fragile natural and historical locations. Not all national parks look alike, and that's the point. They're special. They are set aside not just for us today, but for future generations. Not for us just to see from afar, but to get out and explore. America has not always been the vast, conquered continent that it is today. Not so long ago, America was a very different place. Endless forests were broken up by wild rivers. America seemed to be divided by mountain ranges with few passes through them. Vast seas of grassland, inhospitable deserts. Native American settlements were small islands of civilization between the vast stretches of wilderness. The America that we know today was very different at this time. The Americans at the time only had one goal: to conquer it all. And they just about did. As Americans looked westward, guided by their manifest destiny, their enemies, nature and the natives, stood little chance. Through brutality and determination, grit and ingenuity, the United States set about taming the wilderness and pushed off the few last remaining tribes that disease and war had not already destroyed. Entire forests were cleared. Mountain ranges were carved up. The unpredictable rivers were now dammed. Today we can hardly imagine what the vast untamed landscape of North America used to look like. But not all who went out into the wilderness were looking to conquer. At the time, John Muir and Glenn Clark were relatively unknown, but through their conservation efforts, they have become legends in their own right, next to the great explorers Lewis and Clark, and standing side by side with American presidents like Teddy Roosevelt. These early conservationists would explore the region along with many other like-minded explorers, and they would lead the way in the conservation effort here in the United States that continues to this day. Their work and advocacy saved America's natural wonders, but more importantly, their words still inspire us today. These men came just in time. Following the American Civil War, more settlers in the now reunited United States were looking west. To escape from the horrors of their past, maybe to start a new life in these western lands of opportunity. As more and more immigrants poured off the boats in the East Coast, the need for land increased and more were pushed west. As the 49ers looked for gold, as farmers looked for Oregon, as more and more wagons came west, more and more natural wonders were being discovered, mapped, and ultimately photographed. These images would spread around the world. As the West was won, a new battle against man was brewing. Under increased threats, these lands were slowly becoming more and more in danger. In order to protect these lands, conservationists petitioned the United States government to preserve some of America's most valuable national treasures and natural wonders. With years and years of pressure and advocacy, the United States government acted, and thus began what became called America's greatest idea. In 1872, the 42nd Congress of the United States passed the Yellowstone National Park Protection Act. Yellowstone, then as today, was an exceptional corner of our country. The pictures and descriptions coming from out west to back east must have seemed otherworldly. Massive herds of buffalo, colorful geothermal springs, waterfalls carving out canyons.
Many visitors, when they come to Yellowstone National Park, don't realize that they're in one of the world's largest active volcanoes.
There is simply nothing quite like it. And thanks to conservation efforts, it's still here today.
Yellowstone National Park is more than just a place. It is an idea about preservation, about families, and about tomorrow.
Yellowstone was the first national park in the United States. It is also widely held to be the first national park in the world. America's idea of preservation would be a blueprint for future generations. It has not always been clear. Even today, the balance between accessibility and preservation is a tough one to find. But Yellowstone National Park still stands as a shining example of what can be accomplished. America's first national park still stands as a shining example of the potential of the national park system. Ironically, America's second national park barely lasted 20 years. Mackinac National Park only lasted from 1875 to 1890. This park is in so many ways a contrast to Yellowstone. While Yellowstone protected a massive wild wilderness, Mackinac protected just over 800 acres. While Yellowstone was a remote corner of the United States, this island was in the booming Great Lakes region. While Yellowstone was an attraction just for its natural resources, this island park was next to a popular destination already and a military outpost. While Yellowstone was exceptional, Mackinac was commercial. In some ways, the protection of Mackinac Island was extremely necessary, due to the fact that it might someday become developed out of existence. Its natural beauty may become its curse. In some ways, that's what the national park system was designed to prevent. So what happened to America's second national park? Originally, the creation of this national park was largely the results of efforts by United States Senator Thomas Ferry, a native of Mackinac Island. In Senate Bill 28, Ferry sought to, quote, set aside a certain portion of the island of Mackinac and the Straits of Mackinac within the state of Michigan as a national park. Simple enough. At this time, the concept of conservation was new and still being matured. What should and shouldn't be protected was largely up to who you asked. Should we protect the lands directly next to cities? Should we protect certain lands and exploit others? What was worthy of protection? Mackinac Island, being located in an area under threat from development, seemed like a logical choice at the time. This national park covered 821 acres of the island. The park protected some of the island's most iconic features like the Sugarloaf and Arch Rock. In addition, 103 acres were set aside for Fort Mackinac. This fort directly neighbored the national park. The remainder of the island was to still be privately owned. Fort Mackinac, which continued to serve as a United States Army garrison during the operation of the park, with the fort's commander running the national park and the federal troops serving as its first rangers. This is also how it was done in Yellowstone at the time. The park had the authority to construct roads and trails, nothing controversial there. The park also had the authority to lease a small number of lots and buildings to offset the costs and the expenses of running the park. There was no federal money provided to run this park. There was just one problem with this arrangement. The park also had to be available to the Army for military training and in times of war, something unthinkable today in our national parks. In 1895, the fort was decommissioned. The future of the park was uncertain. Just 20 years after its founding, as the second national park in the United States, at the request of Michigan Governor John T. Rich, the park was turned over to the state of Michigan. Thus, the second national park in the United States was dissolved and became Mackinac Island State Park, the first state park in Michigan. Ironically, as a state park with better funding and more local oversight, the park was able to thrive. Today, the park and the island are one of Michigan's most popular tourist destinations. A very important lesson, and this debate still rings true today. What should be in the national park system? What is exceptional enough? What needs protection enough? What will thrive underneath this system? Just before Mackinac Island became a state park, the next three national parks were added. The then called Rock Creek Park later merged into National Capital Parks, Sequoia, and Yosemite. These three national parks are still with us today, unlike Mackinac. If you're looking to see the highest place in the lower 48, or some of the oldest trees in existence, look no further than Sequoia National Park.
Situated on the western slope of the southern Sierra Nevada in California, the park is a vast landscape of wild and rugged terrain.
Sequoia National Park officially became a park on September 25, 1890. The park contains the highest point in the lower 48, Mount Whitney, at 14,505 feet above sea level. This mountain reaches high into the sky, and still to this day is one of the toughest places to climb in the United States. Located deep in the park, the General Sherman tree is one of the largest trees on Earth by volume. The General Sherman tree grows in the giant forest, which contains 5 of the 10 largest trees in the world. On the other side of the country in Washington, D.C., just 2 days later, Rock Creek Park was established. This park was formed, like all the rest, by an act of Congress, signed by President Benjamin Harrison on September 27, 1890. The park was formed following advocacy by Charles C. Glover, along with other civic leaders. Later in 1924, Congress created the National Capital Park Commission. This commission was tasked with the acquisition of land in Washington, D.C., for the purpose of creating and preserving sites of the Civil War fortifications around the city and interconnecting parkways of the city. These parkways contain many small parks and monuments that are still protected by the federal government to this day. In 1933, control of these parklands within Washington, D.C. was transferred to the National Park Service, thus creating a new park in the system called National Capital Parks. No legislation explicitly created the National Capital Parks, unlike in 1890s when it had to go through an act of Congress to organize it. The park rather was created as a result of an executive order in 1933, a year that saw a lot of changes in the park system.
Oh yeah. Oh my. Old Yosemite Grant.
Yet again, a few days later, Yosemite National Park was formed. Yosemite may have been the fifth park formed, but the preservation history around the Yosemite Valley goes back to the 1860s. The California gold rush had saw many valleys and forests destroyed in the state in the search of gold during the 1850s. Many miners entered the Yosemite Valley looking for gold, but their pans found nothing worth exploring anymore. I guess they should have just looked up. The valley dodged its first bullet. Over the years, rumors of this magical granite-lined valley with massive waterfalls and trees reaching into the sky slowly trickled out of California. Glenn Clark set about exploring these claims. Clark hiked the mountains, stood on the cliff's edge, camped underneath the massive trees.
These trees are thousands of years old. It's hard to wrap your mind around the time that these individual trees have been on the face of the earth.
This man knew this place was special, and if he did not act soon, it would be overrun with farms. Those forests would be cut down, those rivers would be dammed, all the animals would be killed off. Yosemite would be carved up and destroyed. All that made it special, erased from generations of exploitation. Glenn Clark and others lobbied to protect the Yosemite Valley from development.
So in 1864, Abraham Lincoln, who established the Yosemite Grant, giving this land, unpatented federal land, to the state of California to manage as a preserve for the purpose of public use, resort, and recreation for all time.
This early preservation helped pave the way for the national park system. Today, the park is internationally recognized for its granite cliffs, waterfalls, clear streams, giant sequoia groves, lakes, mountains, meadows, glaciers, and its unique biodiversity. Most importantly, almost 95% of the park was designated as wilderness.
Wilderness is a place removed from roads, from buildings, from permanent structures.
A resounding success in conservation. The United States had many federally protected lands in the early 1900s. Spread across the U.S., the federal government had slowly accumulated many sites, some with the name National Park or National Monument behind them. In 1916, these sites would become organized under one umbrella organization, the National Park Service. The Organic Act is held as one of the more lasting and important pieces of legislation in American history. This one piece of legislation single-handedly created the National Park Service. For the first time, America's natural wonders would be protected under a single department with a single goal. The National Park Service was established to promote and regulate the use of federal areas known as national parks, monuments, and reservations. The park system was tasked to conserve the scenery and the natural and historical objects within them. A very tall task for 1916 America. Today we take for granted transportation that can zip us from place to place in the scale of hours. But over 100 years ago, journeys were not measured in hours, they were measured in days and weeks. When the National Park Service was created in 1916, long-distance travel in North America was typically accomplished by train. Railroads were closely involved in the development of the visitor centers such as in Grand Canyon National Park, Glacier, and Yellowstone National Parks, and still survive today as a piece of nostalgia within the park and as a piece of entertainment. In the coming decades, that would change, as steel and rail would be replaced by asphalt and rubber tires. In 1933, there are many changes to the National Park system. The main catalyst for these changes was the Reorganization Act of 1933. This act gave the president the authority to transfer national monuments from one government agency to another. In the summer of 1933, President Franklin D. Roosevelt made use of this power in an unexpected way. There were still many lands in federal control that were not yet organized underneath the national park umbrella. Considering that national parks and monuments were mostly geological wonders and important to American history, it seemed natural for them to fall underneath the National Park Service. There are also other sets of lands that have historical significance to the United States that were not underneath the National Park Service at this time. Although in hindsight it seems obvious, at the time Civil War battlefields had been preserved underneath the War Department. In 1933, that all changed. With two executive actions, the Civil War sites and national monuments were absorbed into the National Park Service, forever changing the scope of the department. Also under this act, many locations in D.C. that had previously taken an act of Congress to consolidate and organize were now placed underneath the new national park, the National Capital Park. 1933 was a transformative year in more than one way. The New Deal programs that were sweeping across the nation would have a profound impact on the national parks. One of these New Deal era programs formed the Civilian Conservation Corps, or the CCC. The Civilian Conservation Corps was a work relief program aimed at putting America's youth to work.
The premise of this program was to offer young men an opportunity to have unemployment relief, getting $30 a month. Now that's a lot of money back then, of course. You see, there wasn't many jobs and economic opportunities, so they had the ability to come up here and do simple labor tasks to bring money back home for their families.
These young men would build roads, cut trails, and construct infrastructure, much of which you can still enjoy today. The program would later expand to ages 17 to 28. The money that these young men earned would be sent back to their families for safekeeping. Beyond the employment, the program provided clothes, food, shelter for these young men. The CCC was designed to supply jobs for these young men and help relieve their families who had difficulty finding jobs during the Great Depression. The impact goal of the CCC was to restore morale in an era that saw almost 25% unemployment for men, a statistic that was much higher for poorly educated teenagers from rural areas. The CCC provided an ideology of manly outdoor work to help counter depression, and the cash drop helped the family out back home. Through a regimen of heavy manual labor, civic and political education, and an all-male living working environment, the CCC sought to build a better man who would be economically independent and self-reliant. At the time of entry, 70% of enrollees were malnourished and poorly clothed. Enrollment peaked at the end of 1935 when there were about 500,000 men set across 2,600 camps in operation in every state, all receiving equal pay and equal housing. By 1939, there was a shift from hard manual work to highly trained citizen soldiers ready for war. By 1942, the need for construction workers was outweighed by wartime needs, and the CCC was disbanded, but its impact still carries on.
Hiking the trails, staying at a cabin like Pocosin right here, grabbing your buddies for a backcountry camping trip, or even just sitting down at the picnic tables and having the classic park picnic. But all of our experiences here in the park boil back down to the Civilian Conservation Corps.
There was not a lot of demand for public works during the fighting of World War II. Many of the CCC boys would take their skills to the war effort by building infrastructure for the military fighting. During the wartime, the demand for public lands was diminished. But with victory in Europe and Japan, millions of young men and women returned home. The end of World War II brought a new demand for our national parks. GIs in the late 1940s and 50s were looking to take their baby boom children into America's national parks, looking for adventure, looking for an escape. In these protected areas, the baby boomers grew up exploring the natural wonders of our country. There was just one issue. By the 1950s, many of the CCC and early structures in these parks were decades old. New crowds brought new demands. Gone were the days of primitive campgrounds, limited utilities, and little to no crowds. The national park system was under pressure and not meeting the needs of its visitors. The biggest change from the early days of the park to the 1950s were how Americans got there and explored these places. The automobile had replaced trains as the primary transportation within the national parks. Millions of visitors were now entering these parks by car. Cars need roads, a place to park, towns to fill up in, and shops to repair them when they break down. With the development of the U.S. highway system as a public works project during the Great Depression, many previously remote parks had become accessible via good roads and inexpensive cars. Car culture was becoming an integral part of the American experience. And on the back of many of these cars were trailers. The atomic era had brought many new comforts into the average American home. And when Americans went camping, they brought these mini homes with them, bringing all new stresses into the park, especially on the campgrounds. By the mid-1950s, it was apparent that a massive investment in the park infrastructure was required. In 1951, Conrad Worth became the director of the National Park Service. His main goal? Getting the parks back up to standards that the public was now expecting. The warriors of World War II were now elected officials, dads, and husbands. They found themselves facing a new challenge: domestic life. The baby boom was on, and the influx of children brought a need for cheap adventures into our national parks.
There were more people visiting their national parks than ever before, but there wasn't the infrastructure to support all of these people coming to their parks.
Car culture made all this possible, and President Dwight D. Eisenhower in 1952 signed off on Mission 66. Mission 66 was a 10-year effort to upgrade and expand park facilities for the 50th anniversary of the National Park Service. New parks were added to preserve unique American resources, and existing park facilities were upgraded and expanded.
It became clear during this time that the parks needed a place of central location where visitors could come to receive information, orientation, and to meet basic physical needs like taking a bathroom break. With this revelation, the idea of the Visitor Center was born.
Mission 66 was conceived as the means to accommodate the increased visitors and numbers and to provide high-quality interpretive centers. While Mission 66 involved a variety of infrastructure projects such as roads, utilities, and employee housing, the most visible component were the interpretive centers and visitor centers inside these parks. Visitor centers were often the first point of contact between the Park Service and their visitors. Basically, these centers were where your adventure began. The National Park Service put a considerable emphasis on appropriate orientation and learning opportunities that these visitor centers could provide, especially as families entered Mother Nature for the first time. These centers laid out important information that visitors would need not only to enjoy their trips, but to take care of these parks. Cape Cod, Point Reyes, Fire Island, and Padre Island were all incorporated into the system under Mission 66. Mission 66 also involved substantial replanning of the entire park infrastructure. While a large portion of funding for Mission 66 was devoted to the visitor facilities, Mission 66 also focused on volunteers, workers, and put an emphasis on their housing. Much of the existing housing was built by the CCC and amounted to little more than cabins at that time. Using a model of post-war cookie-cutter military housing, a series of standardized designs was developed, focusing on the ranch-style detached houses popular at the time. Due to the remoteness of many of the national parks, this new employee housing was greatly needed. In 1966, the Park Service turned 50 years old, and the emphasis began to turn from saving the great wonders and sceneries and unique features and making our parks more accessible to the public. Director George Herzog began the process with the creation of national lakeshores and national recreation areas.
Golden Gate National Recreation Area doesn't look like most national parks. Stretched across 80,000 acres, north and south of the bay, this park is one of the world's largest. With 37 distinct park sites, 140 miles of trails, 1,200 historic structures, and one iconic bridge, Golden Gate connects wild landscapes and the big city. National lakeshores and recreation areas opened up millions of acres of land to development for recreation. There were 27 new units added to the National Park Service between 1955 and 1963, with many of them being this new type of unit. A number of national recreation areas were developed in conjunction with the Bureau of Reclamation, including Glen Canyon and Flaming Gorge, both built around new dam projects.
We are kayaking down in Glen Canyon in some of the most beautiful country in the world.
Today, national lake and seashores make up 826,000 acres and see up to 25 million visitors annually. If you think that's impressive, national recreation areas only take up 3.7 million acres, but they see almost 50 million visitors annually.
Recreation areas can give us a place to play and explore. They can also preserve the many stories of this vibrant desert. Connected through a dependence on water, Glen Canyon's stories see similarities all across America.
These recreation areas have become a popular destination in their own right, rivaling many of the national parks. But their recreational opportunities allow visitors the freedom to choose how they want to explore the areas.
This is my first backpacking trip anywhere, so I didn't know what to expect. So far, so good.
First time I did something like this was about 4 years back. I've been hooked to it ever since. Moments like these, you don't get it very often. Look at this. You go back and you talk about it like for the rest of your life, that you did something crazy as this, something so cool as this, and something that everybody should experience.
Spanning across southern Utah and northern Arizona is Glen Canyon National Recreation Area. Known for Lake Powell and the Colorado River, many have come to take part in the long history of adventure seeking.
Lake Powell has many deep coves within its boundaries that you can access by a small boat, allowing for the unique experience that you can't really find anywhere else. Lake Powell, though, as you might imagine, is not a natural lake. It was formed by a dam in the 1960s, destroying the canyon behind it. The Colorado River now fills up the canyon that was once there. Many of the slot canyons have now been flooded. Many of the larger canyons, though, are still accessible by kayak and boat. This is a very different objective than the National Park Service was originally founded on, to preserve these areas. But with millions of visitors each year, I don't think too many people are complaining. Before the late 1960s, fires were generally believed to be detrimental to the parks and forests, and management policies were aimed at suppressing fires as quickly as possible.
Fire, man's best servant and worst master, can sear a timbered area for generations to come.
In 1935, the U.S. Forest Service policy was that wildfires were supposed to be suppressed by 10 a.m. the morning they were first spotted.
Every precaution is necessary. Fire towers, location finders, communication lines, and firefighting apparatus. Standard equipment in all national parks will be provided here.
Firefighting crews were established throughout the public lands and generally staffed by young men during the fire season.
Then in 1940 came the smoke jumpers. Now the firefighter has a chance in his race against time to corral the fast-moving fire demon.
By the beginning of World War II, more than 8,000 fire lookout towers had been constructed in the United States alone. The need for lumber was high during World War II, and fires destroying timberland was deemed unacceptable.
In fighting forest fires, time is precious. Even the fastest combination of vehicle, horse, and foot travel permitted small fires to gain momentum and become conflagrations before they could be reached and controlled.
During this time, firefighting efforts were highly successful, with the area burned by wildfires reduced from an annual average of 30 million acres in the 1930s to between 2 and 5 million acres by the 1960s.
This short-circuited a natural system. It's really safer to let natural fires periodically remove accumulations of fuel, like pine needles, branches, and downed trees.
In 1944, the U.S. Forest Service developed an ad campaign to help educate the public that wildfires were detrimental, using a cartoon black bear named Smokey. This iconic firefighting bear can still be seen on many posters, with the catchphrase, "Only you can prevent forest fires." Unfortunately, these posters were very misleading to the public and let them believe that most of the wildfires were predominantly human-caused. In fact, in Yellowstone National Park, almost 78% of fires are caused by lightning, while only 22% are human-caused.
Most of the time when a fire starts naturally by lightning here in Yellowstone, it burns less than an acre and puts itself out. Some years are different, and definitely 1988 was a different year.
The fire season of 1988 would not change only the National Park Service, but how we looked at fires throughout the United States.
And then in '88, they had a wet spring, and they thought they were still on track for another good year in that natural fire program. But then the spigot kind of shut off in May and June, and they didn't get that spring moisture that we're accustomed to.
But nearly a century of fire suppression has let fuels build up over large areas of the park. Adding tremendously to the fuel accumulation are the millions of dead trees left from an insect infestation about 9 years ago.
The Yellowstone Fire of 1988 collectively formed the largest wildfire in record in the Yellowstone National Park. Starting as many small individual fires, the flames quickly spread out of control due to drought conditions and increasing winds. These fires combined into several larger fires, which burned for several months. These fires almost destroyed 2 major visitor destinations. The entire park was closed to non-emergency personnel for the first time in history.
Teaming aircraft up with high-tech firefighting gives the fastest fire line construction of all. Your crew of experts unrolls a long, continuous line of fire line explosive. The crew tapes together the ends of each roll of explosive. Then, with appropriate safety procedures, someone attaches an electrical blasting cap to one end of the explosive. Connect the battery and... you just built some first-class fire line.
Despite all the efforts of the firefighters,
Time to go, right now. Get in here! Everybody out.
Only the arrival of cool, moist weather in the late fall brought the fires to an end. By the time the fire was out, there was over 793,000 acres burned, or about 36% of the park, burned either a little bit or severely.
Even with the arrival and help of well over 2,000 U.S. Army troops around Yellowstone, there just aren't enough resources left to put people and equipment everywhere they're needed.
At its peak, more than 9,000 firefighters were assigned to fight the fire within the park. These firefighters were assisted by dozens of helicopters, fixed-winged aircraft, and fire-retardant drop planes.
It is not possible to put out a big fire with these, but you can retard portions of it, enough for crews to come in and do the real work of building line and mopping up.
More than 4,000 military personnel were brought in to help with the wildfire suppression efforts. The firefighting effort alone cost almost $120 million. There were minimal structural losses due to firefighters concentrating around visitor areas.
Incredibly, few buildings were lost, and those which burned were not among the high-priority structures in the settlement.
But still, there was around $3.2 million of damage done to structures. Mixed fires burned both in the canopy and in the vegetation on the ground. If it wasn't spreading one way, it was spreading another. Ground fire spread slowly along the ground, consuming small plants and dead plant material. Many of these ground fires burned for long durations and intensely. This eventually contributed to the loss of many trees whose canopies were never directly burned.
It's depressing, watching the acreage of these fires exceed a quarter of the area of Yellowstone National Park. But it's really not as bad as it sounds.
What happened next, though, changed everyone's perspective on these fires.
One of the neatest things about these lodgepole pine trees, and you've probably seen them all over the park, you've seen areas that are just babies, like this hillside over here. Those trees were planted on September 7th, 1988, as the fire came through. Because the neatest thing about lodgepole pines is they have two different types of pine cones. They have a pine cone that opens regularly, like other trees, but they also have a serotinous pine cone. And that pine cone, the tree covers it with a resin or a sap before it opens, and it sits there on the tree. When a forest fire goes through a lodgepole pine forest, it heats that resin or that sap, the pine cone opens, and it reseeds the forest floor.
This spectacular natural regeneration in Yellowstone was so fast and so comprehensive that no replanting effort was ever attempted.
1/3 of Yellowstone burned in 1988. We didn't plant a tree, and some acres in Yellowstone today have 1 million trees per acre.
The vast majority of plants regrew from existing sprouts that survived the heat and the fires.
We didn't plant any of them. Nature planted them.
Now that the fire had come through and purged the forest, many of these plants could now grow without worrying about the canopies above them.
And the tree only lives about 200 years, so if a forest fire does not go through a lodgepole pine forest every 200 years or so, the forest just starts dying off. And then it's much harder for nature to grow a new forest. So in a lodgepole pine forest, they need to burn every so often to reseed the next generation.
Pretty much right on schedule is how I'd characterize it. It's been a couple hundred years since a big fire event in Yellowstone, and that's what drives this system, and that was the year to have it.
Contrary to what media reports at the time said, the fires killed very few of the park animals. As a result of research conducted after the fires, a new fire management plan was implemented in 1992.
Well, today we're just trying to continue to maintain that natural role of fire in the landscape. So there's a pretty big fork in the road for fire managers is the cause of the fire. So any human-caused fire, by policy, by federal policy, has to be suppressed. But about 80% of our fires here are caused by lightning. So when we have a lightning fire, we have the full suite of options, and that could be everything from just monitoring that fire, but it's really all about risk management. Every fire that we get, that's our top priority, is what is the risk posed to infrastructure, visitors, employees.
Forest fires did not destroy the old forest, they prepared the land for the next forest.
Thanks to the Yellowstone fire, we now have a better understanding of the role that fires play in the natural cycle in our parks.
And ask yourself, was Yellowstone really destroyed or was it just changed? You know, a young forest is every bit as natural as an old forest. We humans, we just have that thing in our mind where we don't like any fire because we're afraid of our yards burning. But in a place like Yellowstone, where we let nature take its course, fires are every bit as natural as an old unburnt forest, a young forest is.
National park visitation grew steadily over the decades, but that all changed with the invention of social media and the Instagram travel culture. Starting in 2012, it became increasingly more common to see many of America's natural wonders alongside many cities and theme parks as marquee places to see. These parks have always been a draw, but with the emergence of social media, they are now quickly becoming the target of social media influencers and a prize feature on many Instagram feeds.
What concerns me is that visitation has doubled in recent years and most pronounced in the last 5 years, and that trajectory of rising visitation shows no signs of stopping. What that does for our visitors, on entry to the park, they face long lines to get in, and then once they're in the park, they spend their time searching for a place to park in the overcrowded parking lots.
This social media explosion not only created demand for historically popular locations already established within the park system, but arguably, social media put one American icon on the map single-handedly. Horseshoe Bend was a remote and unknown spot along the Colorado River, unknown except by locals at least. As geotagging grew, so did the popularity of this spot.
But almost overnight, an overlook that once saw 4,000 visitors a year began seeing 2.2 million visitors a year. That's over 4,000 visitors a day.
By 2016, the location saw so much traffic it was necessary to build official facilities on the property. Now the site sees thousands of visitors each day. The most astonishing thing is that this site 20 years ago did not even appear on maps. Now it is one of America's most recognizable locations.
My name is Russell Mitchell, and I'm the battalion chief for Prescribed Fire and Fuels in Yosemite National Park. You know, Yosemite is about 95% wilderness, and fire is a big part of the wilderness.
The drier climate among western United States parks has made the prevalence of wildfire an all too common sight.
Unlike in many forest ecosystems, the desert is not a fire-adapted ecosystem, and fire should not be present. It really opens the door to bringing in invasive plants that don't belong here. Our native plants just grow so slowly. It takes so much time to recover from the process of fire that shouldn't be here anyway, and those non-natives really are able to take advantage of that and come back and take over an area.
Since the 1980s, wildfires across the United States, not just in the national park, have been on the rise.
Many other fires were burning in California at the time, so air assistance was not available for the first few days. The Dome Fire ended up burning 43,000 acres and over 1 million Joshua trees.
Generally, there are peaks and troughs, but overall, the trend is increasing.
Sierra Nevada is a fire-adapted ecosystem, and these forests need fire to be sustainable.
Historically, when we would have lightning events, those fires would not spread because there was no carrier fields, there was no grasses to move the fire around. So those fires would stay very small and they would go out pretty quickly. Now, as you can see, the grasses have taken over and they become the primary carrier of the fire. So when we get a lightning fire or a human-caused fire, it becomes incredibly difficult for us to stop the fire and keep it small now.
When the parks are not on fire, they are now facing floods. Yellowstone National Park in 2022 had the majority of its northern section completely cut off suddenly by a flash flood through the valleys.
Combined rain and snowmelt, we had about 9 inches of rain in the northern part of the park. So in between 7.5 and 9 inches of rain throughout the whole northern part of the park. And that, is a significant amount of rain. It's like, 50% of our annual rainfall or even more than that.
The main road through the northern section of the park was completely eroded away, costing millions of dollars in damages. These parks are the lifeblood of many of the local communities around them. When they are shut down, so too are the towns. Speaking of shutdowns,
due to the COVID-19 pandemic, things are different this year.
I want to emphasize that the park remains closed until further notice, and we mean really closed. People showing up at the gate are being turned away by park rangers.
We are announcing Zion National Park will be closed immediately.
For the first time in history, the Great Smoky Mountains National Park is closing for 2 weeks.
In March of 2020, many of the national parks became absent of one of the most iconic animals, humans. Many parks closed their doors, but they left their gates open. Wildlife returned to many of the areas in the park that had been previously overrun with tourists. For a few months, the national parks looked closer to a scene from a post-apocalyptic movie rather than a summer vacation spot.
The only company you will find here, the wildlife that has gotten very comfortable around the campgrounds.
with locked doors and many animals walking around the visitor centers. This did not last long though, as the desire to escape the lockdowns drove many tourists to seek our national parks to explore in this unusual state.
After people flocked to the Grand Canyon, the park was closed yesterday. Crowds are expected this weekend at hundreds of open national park sites across the country.
Many national parks quickly became trashed and overrun by the new mass of visitors exploring these landscapes.
The secret's out, with many Americans looking to leave quarantine households. Even Second Lady Karen Pence dropping by the Smoky Mountains in Tennessee.
Not only are these experiences enjoyable to have, but they're good for us too.
By 2021, most national parks were back to business as usual.
And in 2021, visitations are hitting above average highs each month.
But there was a new change that shaped many of these national parks.
Hi there. If you're planning to visit Arches between April 1st and October 31st, you'll need to purchase a timed entry ticket to enter the park between the hours of 7 a.m. and 4 p.m.
One of the most popular destinations at Acadia is Cadillac Mountain. If you want to drive a personal vehicle to the summit between May 25th and October 22nd, 2022, you will need to buy a vehicle reservation in addition to a park entrance pass.
The reservation system has dramatically changed how visitors travel in the national parks.
The vehicle reservation helps to reduce congestion, increase safety, and make finding a parking spot a lot more predictable for visitors.
This system was first introduced as a crowd control measure during COVID. There were a limited number of slots available, and if you did not have a reservation, you were turned away.
All visitors need a park entrance pass. You can buy and print a pass before you leave home at recreation.gov.
Like in the early days of Instagram, these reservations became a prize ticket due to the experience of exploring these parks during COVID.
No one could have predicted the impact of COVID-19 on our society, our way of life, our economy. However, I truly believe that our national parks were a refuge. They were a refuge for many Americans during the pandemic. It was good for the soul when Americans visited their national parks.
A time where they were quite the escape. Some people hated, others were envious, but all could appreciate the unique experience that exploring Yosemite National Park with little to no traffic and the wildlife running free. Many of these parks still use the system in order to help protect the landscape by limiting the impact that the large number of people can have on an environment.
If we can manage visitation in that way, it will actually enable us to get more visitors into the park without having that crowded condition that is so disillusioning to them. People are used to making reservations, so even though this is kind of different for a park, we don't think it will be too hard for people. They make reservations for their hotel on the trip, they make their reservations for their campsite, they make dinner reservations, they make reservations for a river trip. All of those things are part and parcel of what people currently do on their vacations, and we think this will fit right in.
Not all, but many key attractions in the national park system either have seasonal or year-round restrictions. One of the most recent additions to the reservation list is Angel's Landing in Zion National Park. Angel's Landing is one of the most recent famous social media locations that has become a must on any traveler's feed. But the popularity of this site overshadows the danger the hike imposed. One of the most recent changes due to demand and long-term outlooks was the Park It Forward program in Great Smoky Mountains National Park.
Today is an historic and exciting day as we announce the adoption of the Park It Forward program. This was not an easy overnight decision, but the overwhelming support from park visitors across the country, and especially those in East Tennessee and Western North Carolina, made it easier.
Great Smoky Mountains for generations has been a free park with easily accessible roads to explore the mountains. Great Smoky Mountains is America's most visited national park, seeing millions of visitors each year. The free and open nature of the park has made it an iconic and accessible park location. Unfortunately, in the last few decades, the park has seen a massive surge in visitation, overwhelming many of the park's facilities. It is not uncommon on a busy day not to be able to find a parking spot in most of the major parking areas for hours on end. Along many of the roads, it is not uncommon to have traffic jams due to high visitation.
The overriding message from the public was clear. We value the park and we're willing to invest in protecting it for future generations. Still, some felt hurt by this plan. For some, this feed program conflicts with personal beliefs, as well as beliefs that have been handed down from past generations who sold their lands to create the park. We heard you. Those moments weighed heavily on me, but let me share what even weighed heavier on my soul. My duty to ensure this park is protected, to ensure our employees have the tools to do their jobs, and to ensure the visitors of tomorrow have this sacred place to explore. With Park It Forward, we will accomplish these important goals.
So effective March of 2023, the Park It Forward program we put into place requiring a parking pass along the roadway. This is the most recent generation of crowd control systems being implemented across the national park system. In the 50 years since Mission 66, many of the buildings under the program have aged and required repair and modernization.
Not all visitor centers built as part of the Mission 66 project were well received by the public.
Many of these buildings have been torn down.
Over the years, the facilities and parks are falling into disrepair and are in desperate need of attention. It becomes harder for the public to enjoy and learn the stories of these amazing places when the infrastructure is crumbling.
I rise today in support of the Great American Outdoors Act. Protecting wilderness reflects the best values of Oregon: environmental protection, stewardship of our land, and community partnership. The Land and Water Conservation Fund represents a bipartisan commitment to safeguarding natural areas.
Additionally, this bill provides nearly $10 billion for long-delayed maintenance projects, repairs, and upgrades to make the national parks greater than they have ever been before. We think that's going to happen.
In 2020, President Trump signed into law the Great American Outdoor Act.
The legislation I'm signing today builds on my administration's unwavering commitment to conserving and the grandeur and the splendor of God's creation.
Our national parks are part of what truly sets America apart from the rest of the world. And this bill was a historic investment in our parks at a very critical time.
Each year, millions of people from all over the world enjoy the national parks. Yet today, more than 5,500 miles of paved roads, 17,000 miles of trails, and 24,000 buildings in the national parks are still in need of improvement. The Great American Outdoor Act provides the necessary funds for this.
The National Parks and Public Land Legacy Restoration Fund that was created as part of the Great America Outdoors Act is a bipartisan down payment on infrastructure.
This act dedicated $1.9 billion per year for 5 years to fund the maintenance of the National Park Service. These infrastructure updates will preserve many of the national park treasures and give Americans better opportunities to explore the great outdoors. The National Park Service continues to modernize as both environmental and visitor needs continue to evolve. In many ways, the United States National Parks and Park Service has embraced these challenges, offering programs that both encourage and educate visitors on how to respect these lands and leave no trace for future generations.
When hiking, make sure you stick at the trail in front of you. Do not wander off, do not create any social trails.
Today, the National Park Service employs almost 20,000 people, and as of 2019, they had more than 279,000 volunteers. The National Park Service also affects local economies at both the national, state, and local levels. According to a 2011 Michigan State University report, for every $1 the National Park Service puts in, it gets almost $4 in economic value in return. In 2011, national parks generated $30 billion in economic activity and created 52,000 jobs nationwide. Most of that money went to communities within 60 miles of the National Park Unit. Beyond the economical impacts, the National Park Service has taken a new look at how it conserves these lands for the future.
We are part of an international effort to look at change in climate and alpine vegetation and diversity. We go to the top of the mountain and it's really simple work. You put out quadrats or meter square plots and we record what vegetation is there, and we come back every 5 years to see if it's changed.
The park came up with a RAD philosophy to live by.
To ensure it remains Crater Lake blue, park scientists use the lake as a living laboratory. Every summer, they take the pulse of Crater Lake.
All right, going down.
Resist the trajectory of change by working to maintain or restore ecosystem processes, functions, structures, or composition based upon historical or acceptable current conditions. Accept the trajectory of change by allowing ecosystem processes to function, structures, or composition to change without intervening to alter their trajectory. Direct the trajectory of change to protect the parks by actively shaping ecosystem processes, functions, structures, or composition towards a new desired condition.
The ocean model incorporates precipitation, river flows, tides, storm winds, and atmospheric pressures to predict storm effects with and without anticipated future sea levels. This helps people working on the ground in parks see what areas are susceptible to impacts and plan for the future.
Park scientists use satellite maps, airboats, and helicopters to understand how the vegetation in the Everglades is changing.
Basically, resist change to environment as much as you can, accept that there will be some change, but that change needs to make sure that the environment can still function as necessary. Whenever change is inevitable, try to direct that change to keep everything functioning as closely to normal as possible.
It's really our duty to explain those changes and try to appeal to the greater public that we do have an impact on that landscape.
The National Park Service has come a long way in the last 100 years. Yellowstone still continues to be one of the most popular national parks not only in the United States, but around the world. Many countries have also followed the United States in protecting their natural environments for future generations. In the Old World, thousands and thousands of square miles of land have been set aside in reserves or parks. Other countries across the world have also been following our lead. Australia alone has hundreds of national parks to protect its natural wonders for future generations. Across many African nations, there are massive national parks set aside to preserve the last untouched habitats on the planet. In the United States, the national park system grew from a handful of parks to well over 400 units, encompassing some of America's most important and historical wonders. Many American battlefields have been preserved for historical record. Many of America's national historical buildings have been painstakingly saved from destruction and made accessible to the public, all underneath the National Park System.
With the passing of the bipartisan-supported Great American Outdoors Act and the Legacy Restoration Fund, there is now an opportunity for us to rethink and deliver deferred maintenance and facilities projects in a different way. With the help of these funds, the National Park Service created regionally based maintenance action teams. These teams consist of skilled tradespeople who train and work alongside park facility crews to tackle the backlog of high-priority deferred maintenance and repair projects. Not only are maintenance action teams assisting parks across the country, they are also engaging and training the next generation of park stewards.
Each year, more and more lands are added to the National Park System to be forever preserved and protected from development. These lands have been under constant attack, but through the efforts of volunteers, park rangers, and visitors, they continue to live on. Many of the parks today are more wild than they were when the National Park System was first founded.
What it really comes down to is what we care the most about. When we really care about something, we'll make an effort to conserve it.
Even though there are new challenges facing these protected areas, thanks to education, visitors today are far more equipped to enjoy and protect these areas than ever before.
Leave No Trace outdoor ethics are a series of conscious decisions that outdoor users can make in order to reduce their impacts on the environment in places like this.
In many cases, these new challenges offer new opportunities for the next generation to explore and enjoy these areas in their own way. Geotagging might have put many remote areas in danger, but it has also encouraged millions more to get out and enjoy these areas in the first place.
If a person feels like they're participating and they're really connecting to the parks, they'll feel a sense of responsibility, of stewardship, a passionate connection to the nature that they got to be in when they were in the park. And it's a little bit deeper than a yes or no question. It's more of a feeling, an experience, a sense of wonder.
Bringing a little mental health into a time when millions of Americans are looking for it. Always remember, not all who wander are lost. If you're looking to explore many of these national parks, No Now Go Later has thousands of locations with the info that you need to know before you go.